I am here with Dr. Mohammed Azadpur. He is a philosophy professor at San Francisco State University. Hi, Dr. Azadpur.
Hi, Sahar. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be seen. Dr. Azadpur, you have written extensively, and you have two very large, detailed books that involve Islamic philosophy. Is Islamic philosophy the same as Arab philosophy?
Very good question, Sarjan. Yes, it is true that much of what we call Islamic philosophy is written in Arabic. But there are also significant texts and significant philosophers who wrote sometimes their majority of work, like for example, the famous Nasser Khosrow. They wrote their writings in Persian, and then also there are people like Allama Iqbal who wrote some in Urdu, some in Persian, and there are many philosophers whom we are beginning, in fact, to discover their work that wrote in Ottoman Turkish. So, what is what I when I use the word the phrase Islamic philosophy, I mean to be inclusive of all of these movements, because all of these thinkers, in one way or another, are dealing within the writing within the Islamic milieu, and but they're not necessarily Arabs or writing in Arabic. But this is not to underestimate the significance of Arabic language and also the importance of Arab philosophers. And I also do believe that we could categorize what we do in different ways. For example, in the European tradition, we have German philosophy, French philosophy, that philosophy demarcated on ethnic lines. And we can do the same. I'm recently interested in identifying kind of what it is to have something called Persian philosophy, and I think there are several other philosophers or aspiring philosophers who are also interested in that category, and I think that's an important thing to inquire into. But for the most part, because I wanted to be inclusive in my treatment of certain philosophers within this maybe geographic area, you might say, that I preferred the term Islamic to Arabic.
So what I hear you saying is that Islamic philosophy is Arabic philosophy, but Islamic philosophy isn't always in Arabic, the language. Okay, and
well, I don't know what you mean when you say Islamic philosophy is Arabic philosophy, because in the first part of your proposition, because so that's the point I wanted to make, that there are a lot of non-Arabs that are contributing to that philosophical tradition, who also write in Arabic, but sometimes they don't write in Arabic, they write in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, or what other languages within that milieu. So yes, so I do believe there's an Arabic tradition and a philosophy, and sometimes you, like for example, philosophers like Averroes and Kindi could properly just be categorized as Arabic or Arab philosophers. But someone like Avicenna, who writes majority of his writings in Arabic, but also has Persian texts, but who is ethnically Persian, is kind of curious. So I don't. That's why I prefer Islamic philosophy to Arabic philosophy in my writings. But I do believe that there are a lot of important philosophers and scholars who are using the phrase Arabic philosophy to perhaps be inclusive of what I write too.
I'm glad I misspoke so that you could clarify. And thinking further, you mentioned like German philosophy. I'm thinking Immanuel Kant, or French philosophy. I'm thinking of Rene Descartes. What is unique about Islamic philosophy?
Nice. Very good point. So there are a number of things that are important, but one of the things that I focus on in my writings on Islamic philosophy is the centrality or the importance of the concept, and you might even say the phenomenon of prophecy in these writings, and the sort of prophetic philosophy, this notion of in Arabic ilham or wahy, that is inspiration, and the importance of that ethically, epistemologically, metaphysically, aesthetically, um, is something that I found brings together a lot of these thinkers, um, and they take that concept seriously and incorporate it into their writings, in fundamental ways.
Going through your book, one of two of them, I skimmed through this portion where Avicenna and Ghazali are both thinking about prophetic symbols. So now that we're on the topic, could you tell me more? What is a prophetic symbol?
Prophetic.
Prophetic, what is that exactly?
Mhm. Well, the example, for example, I'm sorry, the example that I worked on in the book that you mentioned in Reason Unbound was this verse from the Quran, the Ayatul Nur, that is the verse on light, and how so as a symbolism, as a form of prophetic symbolism, that is an inspired verse that by a prophet, that they try to kind of engage in a hermeneutics, um, and this idea of the hermeneutics of symbolic prophecy is, I believe, something that is interesting and peculiar about the philosophers within this tradition. And not every one of them engages in this kind of exegesis or hermeneutics, but it is a significant aspect of some of the prominent philosophers like Avicenna or Ghazali in this tradition. And I use the word, I use the name Avicenna as the Latinized version of Ibn Sina. I'm sure your um, audience might be aware of that. Ibn Sina is the name of the philosopher in Arabic and Persian, or the way it's sort of made brief, is a longer name. But in Latinized languages, it became Avicenna, or but it's more familiar to the philosophical milieu in the West than Ibn Sina. So just to make that sort of clear. Ghazali has fortunately not been, changed that drastically. So Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali is a Khorasani philosopher who incredibly influential both within the Islamic Middle Eastern traditions as well as the Western traditions. And like people like Thomas Aquinas were, well versed in Ghazali's views, and the same as an Avicenna as well. I mean, some are arguing that Aquinas, for example, is an Avicennist, that he's like just working out and adjusting or appropriating aspects of Avicenna in a different way, but mainly within an Avicennian philosophical system. So yes, I'm sorry, I lost track of the question. I went on the tangent here.
A good one, a good one. I'm glad I got it recorded. Prophetic symbols, what is it? And what did Avicenna and Ghazali think about this? Do they have the same
Yes,
view?
very good.
View?
Very good. Yeah, so I in my book, I argue that I argue that there is a significance to hermeneutics of revealed texts or revealed symbolism. Um, of course, I drew from this famous French scholar of Islamic philosophy, Henri Corbin, to uh, make a distinction between symbol and allegory, and that's not his um, distinction anyway. It's from the German Romantic tradition. You might even trace it back to Kant in some ways. Uh, but the idea of allegory as a text that is figurative, but it has a meaning that can be expressed, sort of discursively and separately and straightforwardly. But then you have using figurative language to kind of perhaps appeal to children or a novice to introduce ideas. That's allegorical, but symbolic has a kind of authenticity. It's not pointing necessarily to another mode of expression. It itself is expressing what it needs to do on its own. And the argument that I was making is that um, uh, the process of interpreting symbolic text, not allegorical necessarily, although allegorical hermeneutics could also be interesting in a different way, and is, and a lot of people work on that. But symbolic hermeneutics is meant to, in some sense, be transformative of the agent in ways that both Ghazali and Avicenna kind of um, validate and emphasize. So with a kind of this kind of hermeneutics, you are meant to engage the text, but you're not necessarily in the business of conceptual clarity, like getting the concepts in there sorted out. But what you are really engaged in this kind of exegesis or hermeneutics is a self transformation. And the idea is through a self transformation, the text and the meaning of the text reveals itself. I mean, this is um, literally, um, the word hermeneutics in English, for example, or other sort of European languages, and the word in Arabic ta'wil have a similar kind of sense structure. Ta'wil means to go to the beginning. So how do you go to to intention, the origin of the meaning of the text? And the point in a ta'wil is that you are already, in some sense, that beginning is there in view, but you kind of not getting it. But to get it is not to just sort out the words in the text and get their meaning or get clear about some sort of conceptual content, but rather it is to change yourself. So the distractions, what is taking you away from the meaning that is staring you in the face, is removed. Um, so the whole aesthetic experience of the symbol, the misal, or the rumuz, the secrets, as it were, that are sort of implanted in the text, are they're kind of unveiled for you in a sense, right? So it's something like really a veil that sort of is in the way of your seeing it, and through this hermeneutics slash ethical transformation, you kind of changing that and tearing that, and you're seeing things. So that's the symbolic prophecy has this kind of importance, that it sort of holds the divine meaning that sort of we all aspiring towards, that genuine meaning of our existence, of what we should be doing, what we should be thinking about, etc. And what we are doing is, we, in some sense, through this transformation, self transformation, through engagement with the text, we are bringing ourselves to that original meaning. And
And
both of them are interested in that process.
I'm making up some story in my head about how prophetic symbols are related to dreams. Maybe
Mm.
you can clarify, why would Ghazali, who's working on prophetic symbols,
Mm.
also think and work so deeply into this idea of dreams?
Mm. Yeah. Well, so this is an important question, and a good answer to that would really require a lot of time working out of, for example, the significance of the faculty of imagination in these philosophers. Also, the kind of place these philosophies have in traditions that reach back to ancients, and these texts on dream interpretation and dream analysis that was or has been. I mean, there's also even like an Aristotelian one, not to mention a whole bunch of Stoic and other kind of Hellenistic philosophical approaches to dreams, and of course uh, Ghazali, either through the availability of these texts in the philosophical sources that he has access to, or he had access to, or through the medical channel, right? Because um, some of these texts kind of traverse both the boundary between, say, philosophy and, say, medicine, and that boundary was not always very clearly drawn in ancient times. Um, so he had access to them, and so the idea of the importance of dreams, like in his Munqidh min al-Dhalal, deliverance from error, or deliverer from error, that text, he does, in some sense, put the premium on dream experience as the way of access to some sort of divine truth. Whereas, for example, someone like Avicenna, the Peripatetic philosopher, puts the emphasis on the intellect and the intellectual intuition um, of the forms, the divine forms that are, in some sense, not only available in this kind of conjunction with the divine intellect, but also because the divine has dispersed these forms in the world and in our intellect, as it hasn't developed yet, but will has the potential to develop. It's all over, and so intellect has a primacy in Avicenna, whereas for Ghazali it's the faculty of imagination, and specifically its employment in dream experience that for him um, has a more central role, uh, that and intellect is just sort of like the discursive faculty that helps you make sense of what dreams impart. Um, but anyway, I hope that sort of. But it's a lot to be unpacked there, and hopefully, um, I'm teaching a class next semester, so maybe some of your audience can find their way there, and we'll be talking a lot about
Excellent.
Avicenna and Ghazali and their views of imagination and intellect.
Yes, and I'm thinking more now, if you're calling Avicenna Peripatetic, this is the people who walked around like Aristotelians, right? So
Right.
these Islamic philosophers, they read Greek philosophy?
Mm. Oh,
Interesting.
yeah. Yes, of course. That's a very good point. The specialist in your audience would know, of course, but the non-specialist would not necessarily know that really Greek philosophy was preserved through Arabic philosophers, through the work of Arabic or Arabic speaking, an Arabic text, that is translations um, of the philosophical texts that were available in Greek and Syriac, mainly, into Arabic in the beginning of the, some argue even as early as during the Umayyad period, but also the Abbasid Caliphacy, that the caliphs commissioned um, many translators, most of them or almost all of them Christian, to translate these philosophical and scientific sources into Arabic, and thereby kind of starting up a very lively and rich and uh, long lasting. It continues to this day philosophical discourse and practice that um, has not only uh, contributed greatly on its own, but it's also has sort of branched off into Europe and really inspired the emergence of modern philosophy in the European tradition.
So this makes me want to ask why today's young philosophers aren't buzzing to go read Islamic philosophy. If Islamic philosophers like Avicenna are the ones who got to read those Greek texts and preserved that knowledge, and it's from these Islamic philosophers that Europeans even got the information, it seems like there would be much more value on Islamic philosophy, and that's lacking. Is there something wrong or lacking with how Islamic philosophy is read today?
Well, this is a really good question. So part of the answer involves references to things like colonialism, post-colonialism,
Politics.
also maybe some genuine sort of like inheritance concerns, like you inherit certain views from certain others, and you're talking to a community that may not be friendly to the source of your inheritance, but you don't want to kind of like poison the text by saying that's where I got them from, but rather just have them work it on their merits. I think some of that is at work in like Middle Ages and scholastic traditions, when Christian philosophers are taking from, say, Avicenna or Ghazali or other Averroes, but they don't want to necessarily um, um, you know focus on the source. Rather, they just want to make sure. So that's that. But I think the stronger uh, reason for why there's this kind of um, lack of awareness is this kind of um, there was this, I had to use Edward Said's famous terminologies, Orientalism in academic circles in the West, and Orientalism basically means, in a sense, to downgrade the culture and civilization of Eastern traditions, and with Oriental, they literally meant Middle Eastern, um, rather than Far Eastern. Nowadays, we use the word Oriental to kind of point to the Far East, but in the way Say is using Orientalism, and the way Orientalism is in sense practiced in European intellectual tradition, it's mainly concerned with Middle Eastern Islamic tradition, and in some sense, it is in the business of um, classifying it as a tradition that we are justified in the West to go and in some sense exploit these people, even though they have had this level of culture, because it's not quite rational and quite um, uh, um, sort of available as the Western tradition is. So in some sense, by making or producing knowledge of the Middle East as something that is subpar in compared to the West, in comparison with the West, that then therefore we are, we're okay to go and exploit a whole population and their resources and so on, because they're not like us, they're not as profound and as civilized as us, and they're not really worth reading. We as scholars are going to kind of do the work for you and sort of give you the main points, but really, you don't need to go and read them. So in academic philosophy, we tend to kind of do the Greeks, and skip over the Islamic philosophical tradition, really do some Thomas Aquinas, maybe earlier Christian tradition as well, like Augustine, and then we come to modern period, Descartes and Kant and so on, and that has been the way sort of the canon has been formed, and the way we kind of engage in how we understand the history of the philosophical tradition. But part of my excuse me, efforts are to kind of talk that away, that this is not the way we should be thinking about the history of philosophy. And to use Adamson's term, we have to look at the history of philosophy without gaps, right? There shouldn't be gaps in our, like, well, here we go, the Greeks, and then whoosh, happened something in the middle, and then we got to the scholastics, and not only skipping a whole tradition that was incredibly significant and in some sense essential to the development of the Western philosophical tradition, but also not seeing how that itself has a kind of autonomy and has been going on, as I said, even to this day, and that we can learn from that tradition as well. Yeah, it's a problem, I believe, and has many many sources for it.
I was not going to add any more questions, but now I really want to ask you something. I hope that's okay. If you could give everyone watching one bit of information about why Islamic philosophy is so cool, what would you say? What would you say to inspire someone to read Islamic philosophy for itself?
Yeah. So I will say this. I hope this won't take too long, but the way I kind of problematize or make philosophy interesting to my students, who are mostly immigrants and first generation Americans who made their way to the Bay Area, and they're really fascinating, really beautiful people who are find themselves in their aspiration towards higher education in a philosophy class as a GE requirement or what have you. And they're like, okay, I'm here to enrich myself, to learn, and to become a contributing member of the community. What is the importance of all this stuff? This philosophy. Why should I read Rene Descartes? I mean, I come from a tradition that has no. Rene Descartes had no appearance, no significance in. I'm, not Christian. I'm not European, etc. And the way I kind of make philosophy interesting to these people, philosophy in general, is to talk about this notion of philosophy as a way of life. That is, philosophy is not necessarily some text that we kind of, plow through to get some understanding, albeit culturally biased and so on, which is what they quickly point out. But rather, it is a text that is actually, as I was suggesting earlier in regard to prophetic symbolism, that is self-transformative. That is, it is trying to kind of bring to full realization your potential as a human being. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it that way, of course, there are cultural limitations to the text and any text, but what they're aiming at is the sort of autonomy that human being ought to be sort of exercising. And so generally philosophy, that's what how I make philosophy interesting to them. And then of course Islamic philosophy, I say, look, like this traditions of philosophy as a way of life, Islamic philosophy interestingly combines sort of philosophy as inherited as we inherit from the Greeks, with the Abrahamic tradition, which is something we all kind of, a lot of us are in some sense engaged with, and it creates a kind of a syncretic text that can be really inspiring and transformative for us. And even if you're not say from one of the Abrahamic traditions, which, as you know, happens a lot in the Bay Area, and is totally fine, it sort of gives them an incentive, which they pursue perhaps in other classes in our department, of how to say bring philosophy together with Hinduism, with Confucianism, and so on. So it's a interesting melange of uh, um, philosophy as sort of given to us by the Greeks, and the Abrahamic traditions as sort of given to us by Jews and Christians and Muslims in this case too. And that's it's a really powerful and sort of transformative experience. So that's how I hooked them.
Beautiful.
And I and I try to kind of not just as a hook, but as like, well, look, I'm gonna let you see how that works through the semester. And it's been going on for 20 years or so, and and with some success in some cases.
Excellent. Dr. Azadpur, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me on your program.